Lucky Luciano, the mafia mastermind who structured the underworld. He wasn't the first gangster in America. Al Capone had already made headlines in Chicago. Dutch Schultz controlled Harlem. Arnold Rothstein had fixed the World Series. He wasn't the richest either. By some estimates, Capone was pulling in over $100 million a year at his peak. But Charles Lucky Luciano was something different, something more dangerous. He was the one who changed the game forever. Lucky Luciano didn't just run a crime family. He invented the modern American Mafia. He took bloody, chaotic street gangs and turned them into a disciplined, nationwide criminal corporation. He replaced vendettas with board meetings, knife fights with negotiations, and endless gang wars with profitable peace. And he did it all with a charming smile, a firm handshake, and, when absolutely necessary, a precisely placed bullet. They called him Lucky, not just because he survived a brutal attempted murder that left him with a permanently drooping right eye, but because every calculated move he made seemed to turn chaos into gold, enemies into allies, and violence into profit. This is the story of the man who organized the unorganizable, the immigrant who built an empire, the visionary who left behind a criminal blueprint that still shapes the underworld today, nearly 60 years after his death. Charles Luciano was born Salvatore Lucania on November 24, 1897, in La Cara Friddi, a dusty sulfur mining town in the mountains of Sicily. This wasn't just any part of Sicily. This was the birthplace of countless future American gangsters. The poverty was crushing. The government was corrupt. And young boys learned early that violence was often the only path to respect. At just 9 years old, little Salvatore clutched his mother's hand as he stepped off a crowded, stinking steamship at Ellis Island. The year was 1906. Theodore Roosevelt was president. The Statue of Liberty promised freedom. But for the Lucania family, America would offer something else entirely. Opportunity of a very different kind. They settled on Manhattan's Lower East Side, in a cramped tenement at 265 East 10th Street. This neighborhood was a melting pot of desperation. Italian immigrants lived next to Irish dockworkers, Jewish tailors, and Chinese laborers. The streets swarmed with pickpockets, con men, prostitutes, and children who'd learned that survival meant taking what you needed. Young Salvatore spoke broken English with a thick Sicilian accent. Kids mocked him at school. Teachers ignored him. But he understood something that transcended language. Power came from respect, and respect came from fear. And fear came from proving you were more dangerous than the other guy. By age 10, he was running with the local street gang, the 5 Points Gang. By 14, he'd dropped out of school entirely. Not because he wasn't smart, but because the streets were teaching him lessons no classroom ever could. He started exactly where every gangster started, running errands for older thugs, extorting younger kids for protection money, playing lookout during robberies. But unlike most street criminals who lived day to day, hand to mouth, Luciano was already thinking strategically. He noticed something that would define his entire criminal philosophy. The Italian gangs fought the Jewish gangs. The Jewish gangs fought the Irish gangs. The Irish gangs fought everyone. All this violence was incredibly wasteful. Bodies in the street meant police attention. Police attention meant less money. Less money meant everyone suffered. So, even as a teenager, Salvatore Lucania was doing something revolutionary, making friends across ethnic lines. He befriended Meyer Lansky, a brilliant young Jewish kid with a head for numbers. He impressed Frank Costello, an Italian-American who understood politics. These weren't just friendships. They were investments in the future. Luciano's real break came on January 17, 1920, the day America banned alcohol. The 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act made drinking illegal overnight. Politicians called it a moral victory. Luciano called it the greatest business opportunity in American history, while most gangsters were still thinking small, maybe running a few speakeasies, hijacking the occasional truck. Luciano was envisioning something massive. He partnered with his old friend Meyer Lansky and the charismatic but violent Bugsy Siegel. Together, they built a bootlegging operation that supplied illegal alcohol to hundreds of speakeasies across New York, New Jersey, and beyond. But there was a problem. The Italian-American Mafia was still controlled by what younger gangsters mockingly called the Mustache Petes. Old-school bosses like Joe the Boss Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, who clung to outdated Sicilian traditions. These old bosses insisted that real mafia men only worked with other Italians. They refused to deal with Jewish gangsters, Irish politicians, or even Italian Americans they considered insufficiently pure. They conducted business in Sicilian dialect. They settled disputes with vendettas that could last generations. Luciano, who had by now Americanized his name to Charles Luciano, thought this was not just stupid, but financially suicidal. He believed organized crime was like any other business. You needed the best talent, regardless of where they came from. You needed to adapt to local conditions. And most importantly, you needed to prioritize profit over pride. By the mid-1920s, Luciano was working as a lieutenant under Joe the Boss Masseria, the most powerful Italian crime boss in New York. Masseria controlled the docks, ran numbers games, and had his fingers in dozens of illegal enterprises. But he was old-fashioned, suspicious, and increasingly paranoid about ambitious young men like Luciano. The situation exploded into what historians call the Castellamarese War, a bloody conflict between Masseria's organization and a rival faction led by Salvatore Maranzano, an educated Sicilian who saw himself as a Caesar of crime. Bodies started dropping across New York. Restaurants became battlefields. Loyal soldiers were gunned down in barbershops. The violence was so intense that even corrupt cops started cracking down, which hurt everyone's business. While older bosses saw only a war to be won, Luciano saw an opportunity to revolutionize organized crime forever. He began playing the most dangerous game possible, secretly working both sides of the conflict. During the day, he sat in Masseria's social club, nodding respectfully as the old boss ranted about Sicilian honor and the need to crush Maranzano. At night, he held clandestine meetings with Maranzano's representatives, carefully building trust and negotiating the terms of what would come next. On April 15, 1931, Luciano made his move. He invited Joe the Boss Masseria to lunch at Nuova Villa Tomorrow, a quiet restaurant in Coney Island. They ate pasta, discussed business, and played cards. Everything seemed normal. Then, halfway through the meal, Luciano excused himself to use the restroom. As soon as he left the dining room, 4 gunmen walked in. They didn't say a word. They simply opened fire, pumping bullets into Masseria until he collapsed face first into his plate of pasta. When police arrived, they found Luciano in the bathroom, claiming he'd heard nothing unusual. The hit had taken less than 2 minutes. It was professional, clean, and it eliminated the biggest obstacle to Luciano's vision of modern organized crime. With Masseria dead, Salvatore Maranzano declared himself boss of all bosses, capo di tutti capi, and appointed Luciano as his underboss. For a brief moment, it seemed like Maranzano had won the war. But Maranzano made a fatal error in judgment. Despite Luciano's apparent loyalty, the new boss of bosses recognized that his ambitious lieutenant was too smart, too popular, and too dangerous to live. He began planning Luciano's assassination. Luciano's network of informants, cultivated over years of strategic relationship building, warned him about the plot. Once again, he would have to strike first or die trying. On September 10, 1931, 4 men walked into Maranzano's office at 230 Park Avenue, flashing fake police badges. They told the secretary they were investigating tax evasion. Maranzano, thinking it was a routine shakedown, invited them into his private office. 20 minutes later, Salvatore Maranzano was dead, shot and stabbed multiple times. The hitmen walked out calmly, nodded to the secretary, and disappeared into the Manhattan crowd. That same day, in coordinated hits across the country, dozens of old-school mafia leaders were eliminated. It was organized crime's Night of the Long Knives, a systematic purge of traditional bosses who stood in the way of modernization. With the old guard eliminated, Charles Lucky Luciano implemented the most revolutionary change in American organized crime history. He abolished the title boss of all bosses. No single man would ever again have absolute power over the entire underworld. Instead, he created the Commission, a ruling council consisting of the heads of the major crime families. Like a corporate board of directors, the Commission would meet regularly to resolve disputes, authorize major operations, and ensure that violence remained strategic rather than chaotic. Luciano restructured New York's Italian-American crime families into the 5 families that still exist today. Luciano's own family, later taken over by Frank Costello. The Genovese family, the Gambino family, the Bonanno family, and the Colombo family. Each family controlled specific territories and rackets, but all answered to the Commission. Under this new system, the families thrived like never before. They controlled illegal gambling operations that generated millions annually. They ran loan-sharking businesses that charged desperate borrowers 20% interest per week. They extorted legitimate businesses for protection money. They infiltrated labor unions and skimmed from construction projects. Most controversially, despite Luciano's later denials, they began moving into narcotics. Heroin from Europe, opium from Asia, and cocaine from South America flowed through mafia-controlled ports and distribution networks. But Luciano's greatest innovation was integration. Unlike the old mustache Pete's, he actively cultivated relationships with Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, Irish politicians, and even legitimate businessmen who could be bought or intimidated. This wasn't just tolerance. It was strategic alliance built in. Jewish gangsters had connections in legitimate finance. Irish Americans controlled political machines. Italian Americans dominated the docks. Together, they created a criminal syndicate more powerful than any single ethnic organization could be alone. But success brought scrutiny. By the mid-1930s, ambitious prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey had made his reputation by taking down powerful gangsters. Dutch Schultz was dead. Waxy Gordon was in prison. Now Dewey set his sights on the biggest prize of all, Lucky Luciano. The problem was evidence. Luciano was careful. He rarely put anything in writing. He communicated through intermediaries. He kept his hands clean of day-to-day operations. Proving his involvement in bootlegging, gambling, or even murder would be nearly impossible. So Dewey went after him for something else entirely. Running a massive prostitution ring that controlled hundreds of brothels across New York City. The charges shocked the public. This wasn't just bootlegging or gambling. This was human trafficking, sexual exploitation, and moral corruption on an industrial scale. The trial began on May 13, 1936, and became a media sensation. Prosecutors paraded dozens of prostitutes and madams through the courtroom, each testifying about Luciano's role in organizing their operations. The testimony was explicit, degrading, and devastating. Luciano's defense team argued that he was being framed, that ambitious prosecutors had threatened and bribed witnesses into lying. They pointed out that many of the accusers were drug addicts, convicted criminals, and people with obvious reasons to lie. But the jury wasn't convinced. On June 7, 1936, Charles Lucky Luciano was found guilty on 62 counts related to compulsory prostitution. Judge Philip J. McCook sentenced him to 30 to 50 years in state prison, effectively a life sentence for a man approaching 40. Many assumed that prison would end Lucky Luciano's influence over organized crime. They were wrong. From his cell in Dannemora State Prison, known as Siberia for its harsh conditions, Luciano continued to communicate with his organization through visitors, letters, and corrupted guards. The commission still sought his advice on major decisions. His family continued to send him a percentage of their earnings. Then came December 7, 1941, and Pearl Harbor. America was suddenly at war, and the U.S. Navy faced a serious problem. German U-boats were sinking ships off the East Coast at an alarming rate. Intelligence officials suspected that Nazi spies had infiltrated the New York waterfront, the same docks that had been controlled by Italian-American organized crime families for decades. In a move that would remain classified for decades, naval intelligence approached Luciano through intermediaries. The deal was simple. In exchange for his cooperation in protecting American ports and assisting with intelligence gathering for the planned invasion of Sicily, his sentence would be commuted, and he would be deported to Italy after the war. Luciano agreed. Through his network of dock workers, union leaders, and waterfront criminals, he provided information about suspicious activities, helped identify potential saboteurs, and ensured that American military supplies moved efficiently through Mafia-controlled ports. On February 9, 1946, after serving just 10 years of his sentence, Charles Lucky Luciano walked out of Great Meadow Correctional Facility a free man. But his freedom came with a permanent condition: immediate deportation to Italy, with no possibility of ever returning to the United States. At age 48, Luciano found himself back in the country of his birth, a place he barely remembered and no longer understood. Italy was devastated by war, occupied by Allied forces, and struggling with massive poverty and displacement. But even in exile, Luciano remained connected to American organized crime. He established himself in Naples, where he could oversee heroin trafficking routes from the Middle East and Asia to the United States. Turkish opium was refined into heroin in Sicilian laboratories, then shipped to American ports controlled by his old associates. He also attempted to establish a foothold in Cuba, where his old friend Meyer Lansky was building a gambling empire under the protection of dictator Fulgencio Batista. Luciano traveled to Havana in 1947, dreaming of creating a Caribbean headquarters for international crime. But American pressure forced the Cuban government to expel him after just a few months. He returned to Italy, increasingly isolated from the empire he had built. By the 1950s, increased law enforcement pressure, betrayal from within his own organization, and the rise of new leaders who didn't share his vision of cooperation began to marginalize the aging crime boss. On a cold January morning in 1962, 64-year-old Charles Lucky Luciano drove to Naples Airport to meet with American film producer Martin Gosch. They were discussing a movie project, the story of Luciano's own life, which he hoped would rehabilitate his reputation and provide financial security in his declining years. As they walked across the terminal discussing the project, Luciano suddenly clutched his chest and collapsed. He died of a massive heart attack before an ambulance could arrive. Fittingly for a man who had lived his entire life in the shadows. His final meeting was about bringing his story into the light. His body was eventually returned to the United States, the country that had deported him, and buried in St. John's Cemetery in Queens, New York, not far from the neighborhoods where he had first learned the rules of the street. Lucky Luciano died nearly 60 years ago, but his fingerprints remain all over organized crime in America. The commission he created still exists. The 5 families he organized still control territory in New York. The business model he pioneered, replacing chaos with structure, violence with negotiation, ethnic tribalism with strategic cooperation, remains the template for criminal organizations worldwide. He proved that in the underworld, intelligence trumps violence, organization beats chaos, and long-term thinking defeats short-term brutality. He took the American dream, the idea that immigrants could reinvent themselves and build something lasting, and applied it to crime. When Mario Puzo wrote The Godfather, when Martin Scorsese made Goodfellas, when David Chase created The Sopranos, they were all drawing on the blueprint that Lucky Luciano had established decades earlier. Charles Lucky Luciano wasn't just a criminal. He was an innovator, a strategist, and ultimately, the architect of modern organized crime. He didn't just break the law, he rewrote the rules of an entire underworld. And in the end, maybe that makes him the most dangerous criminal of all. Not because he was the most violent, but because he was the most successful. His legacy isn't measured in bodies or headlines, but in the criminal empire that still operates according to his principles today.
Subscribe for more stories that make you question everything.